So yeah, I'm gonna speak real quick about participatory development. What does it mean to truly engage the communities where we work? And I will be honest, I'm perhaps have become fairly critical of that over the several years that I've worked in the development industry, because unfortunately, I think there are a lot of practices, there are a lot of projects that are done where the community, the receiving community, is an afterthought at best, where the community that is going to participate in the project is either completely not consulted or done so in a way that is that doesn't take into account the truly the needs of the community, their unique reality, their culture, etc. So I'm going to start with this. What happens when people, communities, aren't involved in shaping their own realities? Um, and I think, that history has shown that whenever people and communities, individuals, cultures are not meaningfully involved in the processes of shaping their own realities and their futures of their day-to-day lives, things generally don't turn out positively, either for the organization, the funding organization, the development organization, and also for the local community. If we go back in time, not too far, a lot of times, when people are not participant in the realities, you get some of the worst atrocities of colonial expansion, where peasant and indigenous communities were violently forced to accept Western culture and lifestyle norms. I'll give an example. My great grandparents on my father's side were from the northern part of, were from Canada, in the northern part of the United States. And my great grandmother was stolen from her family when she was a young girl and forced to go to Catholic school, where she was prohibited from speaking her language, using her own dress, etc. And so this type of, obviously, this might be seen as a extreme example of obviously not listening to people and not allowing them to express their own lifestyles and whatnot. But I think that continues, some of the same values behind that continue to exist with a lot of the very, very assistance-based NGOs, non-government organizations, nonprofits, that tend to impose kind of culturally skewed notions of development on local place-based communities. So, for example, when a organization comes into a community and immediately says, "You all need this, you all need that," a lot of times without taking the time to listen, to participate in the community, to understand some of their differences, a lot of violence and a lot of harm can be happen or can occur. And so here's a few examples. During the several years that I worked in development industry, as anybody who works in development knows, there's a constant flow of projects. We're always searching.
Hello?
Yes, welcome. So I said we're always searching for funds. We're always searching for projects, and a lot of times, because of that, the quickness in the pace of that, the idea of really taking the time to learn about these communities hasn't happened. So in the past couple of years, I've done a couple consulting projects, and so the first one, this picture on the left here, it's a picture of kale. I don't know if you all know what kale is. Kale is a vegetable, a very healthy vegetable. It's one that, for example, in the United States and Canada is kind of enjoyed as what they call a superfood. It has lots of nutrients. And so there's this organization, a faith-based organization, that wanted to work in Africa. And one of their main projects was focused on helping communities create small family gardens. And they raised some funds through churches and through other means. And they went to this community and decided they were going to implement these gardens. And they brought seeds that somebody had donated, all sorts of garden seeds from Canada, from where they were from Canada and in the United States, and they brought them over. And kale was kind of seen as the pilot project, because they saw that there was issues of malnutrition in these communities. There was problems with children not growing, not getting enough nutrients, and so they implemented kale. what should have been, I think, fairly obvious is that kale is a cold weather crop. It's a crop that does well in areas with limited heat. That it's usually what in the United States where I'm from, it's usually considered an early season crop, which means it comes to fruition during the colder months of the spring. And they brought this enormous amount of seed and not just kale but other similar crops into Africa, into this community which was in a very arid, hot and dry region. Um, and the project was a failure. The people put in the effort, built the garden beds, and planted the seeds. And shortly after, that the plants wilted. There was not enough water. The temperature wasn't right. The climate wasn't right. And the result was that the community was frustrated. The organization was frustrated because things didn't go as happened. And eventually, they had to abandon that community and start over somewhere else. That's a pretty blatant example of an organization that comes into a community with an idea already in their head about how to do things without even taking the minimal time to try and learn from that community. I mean, I'm sure they could have, during the consultation, we looked and there was dozens of different types of native crops that were extremely nutrient dense, that had lots and lots of, properties, and that grew very well in that bioregion, it had cultural, in that cultural context. Another example, and this one is perhaps a little bit more difficult. There was a community in Guatemala where we used to live and work, where the community didn't have household water. They had plenty of water in the community through streams and springs and things like that, but there was no system that brought water into the individual homes. And so an organization from Europe came in and saw this. And obviously, for a person from Europe, not having indoor plumbing, not having a water source directly into your home is seen as scarcity and poverty and dearth. It's seen as something that needs to be changed. And so this organization came in, raised some money, and without really consulting the community, brought in, installed a water system, piped, built a big well, put in some pumps, and distributed the water to each and every house. About a couple months after that, somebody came back and kind of looked over at the project, did a short evaluation, and they noticed that all of the women continued to go to the local river to wash their clothes. And the people who were evaluating the project didn't understand that. Why are you doing that? You have water in your house now. It should be easier. You don't have to carry this heavy bucket of clothes down to the river. And the women eventually said that, but we like this. This is the space where we come together as women, where there's no men around, time we can chat, we can make jokes, we can talk to each other about our problems. It was one of the only communal spaces that women in that community had, and they valued that. And eventually what happened was, a couple of years down the road, one of the main pumps for the water system broke down, and the community really didn't have a whole lot of initiative to try and fix it. They had the funds, but they did eventually fix it, but there wasn't this idea that we need this. What was more important for the women in that community was to continue to have this space where they could be together. And these are examples of just not being able to, of organizations who come into communities and don't understand that reality and don't make an effort to truly involve the community in the participative decision-making processes, right? So yeah, what happens in the NGO world, in the development world? We're busy, right? There's all sorts of stacks of reports and budgets and new project papers that we continually have to apply for new grant opportunities to stay alive, to be able to keep our organization financially afloat. There's a commitment that we have. At the beginning, we all say we want to involve our communities. Everybody says that. We know that it's important. But the idea of involving a community from the beginning, from conceptualizing the project, through project management and execution, through the monitoring and evaluation, eventually what usually happens is that process falls by the wayside because we simply feel we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, to do that, because that takes time. It takes time to listen. It's much easier to come into the community and say, you need water in your home. We're going to buy the pump. We're going to bring in the technicians, the engineers. We're going to do this, and then the project's going to be done. It's harder to go into a community and watch and listen and ask maybe if you're a woman, if you can go to the river with them one day and wash your clothes and listen and see what happens and actually hear, more, beyond what people might say. If you convoke a one-time meeting and say, hey, we have this idea about bringing water into your homes. Would you like that? And everybody raises their hand and says yes, and then the project goes forward. Truly participative development is kind of taking your organization outside of that rat race of what is development industry, to listen and to see and to try and participate as much as possible in the reality of the community. So I've broken up my talk. I'm going to try and finish in about half an hour to leave a little bit of time for questions and comments if you all have any. But yeah, so the first part is basically that community participation and true community participation. And by that, I mean not just organizing a one-time meeting where we can listen to what the community has to say, but true community participation. It should be the central part of all of our development work. And there's a quote here from a paper that I had written a while ago. It said, participatory development seeks to give the poor and the marginalized a part in the initiatives and the projects that are designed by outside organizations, in the hopes that these projects will be more sustainable and successful by involving local stakeholders in the project goals. That's a pretty straightforward definition. I wrote this in a paper in a evaluation of a project that I did several years ago. But as I've kind of matured on this idea, I think that that's not necessarily a good definition. And I'm going to explain why here. Oops.
I am not quite sure exactly what is going on at this time. It looks like we've lost Tobias Roberts. His presentation was getting so interesting when it comes to participative community process, the way we can get people involved in whatever a community is trying to achieve. He was giving us examples about what happens when everybody gets that closely or deeply involved in whatever community is trying to achieve or to. But for some reason, okay, yeah, he was out, and I am inviting him back. Hopefully, he will be us very shortly. Let's keep our fingers crossed. I saw him again a short while ago and was trying to get him back, and for whatever reason, which I personally do not understand, he has missed it again. Let me see. But again, I want to welcome everybody to this new AIU class live session. There is Tobias, co-host. Yes, unmute. Let's see what happens. All right, okay. There we go.
I apologize. I think I accidentally clicked
okay.
out.
Technology.
It's difficult, yes. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. I apologize for that. Can everybody see my screen again?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. So yes, I'm going to explain why I think, why that definition is not the best, I guess you could say. So yes, this characterization of participatory development is generally much better than, a lot of the top-down bureaucratic management methods where I guess what we call Eurocentric development agendas are imposed on communities with, an idea of participatory development, something that is becoming increasingly common in almost every project. The idea is that, yes, people have a right to participate in, their own development. But unfortunately, one of the problems with that, I think, is that the focus is still on the project itself. What we think about as most important is that the project needs to be successful, needs to be sustainable, needs to be what that's what we measure. That's what our indicators are around. But in some cases, if we truly value community participation, the community may say that this isn't what we want. That the predefined, the written goals of a project are just not useful. And that can happen at the beginning of a project, can happen in the middle, it can happen at the end. So if we go back to that project of the kale seeds in the desert, if you come in and you, again, organize a one-time meeting and ask communities, we see that you have problems with malnutrition in your children. We want to do a garden project. Are you interested? And everybody's going to say yes. But that's not, so the community, then the organization goes back, writes up a project, has this great idea to import these seeds from Canada, and the project ends up failing. Community participation, if we're going to take that to a next step, isn't about being successful growing kale or growing other types of crops in different regions. What's successful is that community finds a way to improve their nutrition. That can mean completely upending certain methods that the project had seen or that had planted at the beginning. It could mean growing native crops. It could mean in certain parts of the world that it's more focused on animal agriculture. The idea is that you stop and you listen, and that the goals and the objectives of the project are not what determines success or unsuccess, but what the community says, what the community feels throughout the project, from the beginning to the middle to the end. And secondly, instead of simply giving the poor a part in the development initiatives, we believe, and I believe, that genuine participatory development seeks to allow the poor to determine their own visions and establish their own development priorities and agendas. And this is a problem. It's a problem. We're going to talk a little bit more about this ahead, but one of the biggest issues is that there is a pecking order in the development world. There's the funding organizations, the big international donors and funders. Then there's usually some other national organization where the funds go through. Those funds eventually get channeled down to a local partner, and at the end, the community, who are supposedly the beneficiaries, are the end. And allowing the community to have their voices heard along these different steps of the ladder is very difficult. And unfortunately, what happens is that the agenda, the project goals, are usually defined higher up on that ladder. And so, what happens is you have an organization that funds and say, this is our money, this is our funds. We want to fund a project that does X and X things, or that, this is our goal. This is what we want to do. And a lot of times they determine geographical regions where they want to work. We want to work in Central America because we know that migration is a big issue. And so we're going to work with young people to try and give them opportunities so that they don't want to migrate. That sounds good on paper, but once you get into the reality, the complexities of community life here in Central America where I live, a lot of times those projects and what they've written up, just really don't correspond to the reality. And there's not a space, there's not a mechanism where people can truly listen to what those young people here want to talk about. Why are they migrating? Why are they leaving their communities to go to the United States and Canada and Europe? And a lot of times, these ideas is that, it's because they're poor. It's because they don't have job opportunities. No, a lot of times the reality is much more complex. And in order to develop a project that is going to respond to the needs and realities of the people, we have to allow the people at the bottom rung of the ladder, I guess you could say, or at the last step, the community, to make their voices heard in a way that is meaningful and real. And a lot of times that's not the case, because we focus on the sustainability of the project and not as opposed to the sustainability of the community. Real quick, there's different perspectives, I guess you could say, within the world of community development. I guess that what I kind of explained earlier is the predominant model. It's the institutional perspective, and through the institutional perspective, we essentially only seek out the input of communities to help achieve a predefined project goal that was usually decided by someone who is external from the community, usually an expert from the development world. And so, yeah, the idea is that the expert from outside the community knows what the community needs, and they're going to create a project. And the only time we really want the community to truly participate is when they can allow, when they help us to show that that project is being successful, that it's being sustainable. Um, in opposition to this perspective, I get, you can call it many different things: the community perspective, the social movement perspective, the perspective of being kind and authentic and listening to people. So in opposition to the institution of development, true participatory development is something where the main priority and the main goal is allowing for an autonomous forms of community organization to direct and guide the definition of project goals. That means you come into a community and you look and you see what forms of organization already exist there. And there's an interesting example where here in El Salvador, where I live, there was an organization that came and wanted to work with women. Their focus was on gender equality, women's empowerment, which are good and important and needed. And they came in, they tried to organize these kind of like, I guess they called them women's councils. And they brought together women and tried to create these kind of autonomy, these forms of organization. And it lasted for the year and a half that the project lasted. And as soon as the organization left, that those women councils just kind of disbanded. In a couple years, a couple months later, the organization came back to see what was happening, and they saw that the project was essentially a failure in terms of sustainability, because these groups of women's councils were no longer meeting, were no longer participating. And they came and they talked with my wife about this. And my wife said, well, the problem is you didn't look at what forms of organization already existed. And one of the things here is the women in our community love to play softball. And they have a little softball team. It's an informal place where they come together and play. And so the organization came back and tried to reorganize these women's councils, but using the sources of organization that already autonomously existed within the community, which here was the softball team. And you might think, well, a softball team isn't a great place to sit down and talk about gender and women's empowerment, but it was, because it was a place that was owned by the women in the community. It was a place of their own. And eventually, they continue to meet. They might not always sit down and talk about women's empowerment and gender equality, but it's a place that belongs to the women of the community, right? So again, what is the central challenge of truly participatory development? And it's important to recognize from the very outset that participatory development is not easy. It complicates the smooth functioning of projects because it takes time, it takes effort. And a lot of times it requires us to put a hold on all of these streamlined processes of monitoring and evaluation. But when we do allow communities to exercise their sometimes messy, autonomous forms of organization to determine their own development priorities and to be the primary protagonists in shaping their future, this will always lead to more sustainable and consequential development efforts, right? By doing this, projects tend to be more successful, more sustainable, more long lasting. Okay, real quick, the second part of my talk, I want to talk about problem analysis. I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but here in Central America, that's kind of the main starting point for a lot of development organizations. Is they come into our community and they want to talk about what are some of the central primary problems that this community is facing, and there's a problem analysis. And unfortunately, this is usually done in a very top-down, again, hierarchical manner, where technical people are brought in. They look at a community from a very outsider perspective. And when you define problems that way, you're inevitably going to be imposing a certain view of how a community should work. And again, I mean, we've been using this example, but I think it's a good one. When you go back to the example of the women who chose and preferred to wash their clothes at the river, the outsider perspective the expert comes in and sees that, and automatically from his or her own perspective says that is a hardship on women to have to carry bags of, buckets of clothes on their heads down to the river, wash the clothes there, and then bring them back. That's a hardship that women should not have to suffer. That was the problem analysis. The reality was that the women, loved that. They enjoyed that space. It was something that they wanted and that they maintained, even though there was water in their house. And so, when you do problem analysis, if you're going to truly try and understand what a community perceives as their problems, we have to try and do away with a lot of our preconceived ideas of what it means to live a good life. And so, a lot of these ideas are imposed. Most people who work in community development organizations or international development organizations come from Western education, from certain lifestyles where, certainly we define what poverty is, what it isn't. We define what hardship is and what hardship isn't. But if we're gonna do a true problem analysis, we have to be open to the idea that communities may have different perspectives, may think of things differently, right? So one of the most important aspects of quality development work is the process of helping people and communities reflect on the problems and challenges that the community faces and discover innovative solutions to those problems. An NGO, a nonprofit, development organization, whatever, comes into an area offering certain projects and development pathways without ever reflecting together with the community on the real needs and the hardships that the community wants to overcome. When we do this, this is unfortunately adding to the colonialist dynamic of assistance and dependence. And that's something that's existed for a long time, this idea that we know what's best for you and we're going to impose it. And unfortunately, communities, when you see organizations coming in and offering things, most communities are going to say, yes, come with open hands. And a lot of times what that does is that ruins forms of autonomous organization. It ruins forms, of goodness, of good life that communities have developed. And again, this goes back to what I called earlier, the pecking order of international development. So for example, if we're really going to listen to the community's problems, we need to find the humility and the patience to put aside our own development agendas in order to truly hear and take notice of the real and the perceived needs of the community. That is the first essential step in good development work. And so if I put this image here for you all, most people look at this and say, oh, yes, we know what these are. These are the 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, in partnership. Every one of those, 17 sustainable development goals that have been set forth by the UN sound great. And I think that they're important. I know that they're important. But when we impose these goals onto a community without engaging the participant of the community, without doing a problem analysis that takes into account their unique realities, that doesn't take into account the cultural, every one of these sustainable development goals can be a very harmful thing for a community, right? So if we come in, we say zero hunger, and our idea is to teach people to grow crops that do not grow well in that area, that's not going to be good. I'm going to offer an example about education a little bit ahead in one of the next slides. But the idea that education is often seen as something that is universally good. It's great, for young people to get an education. But is it? And in what sense? What type of education? We need to, in order for the Sustainable Development Goals to be positive, they have to reflect the realities of the communities, and that starts with participation. Okay, yeah, so real quick, so how do we do an in-depth problem analysis? How do we make some of these Sustainable Development Goals relevant to the communities? So like I said, take time to involve communities in analysis of the problems they face. That means changing the dynamics of how NGOs function. Move away from writing and conceptualizing projects behind a desk, right? If we're going to write a community development project, it shouldn't happen in an office. It should happen in the community. So if you're going to write a project for small farmers in the mountains of El Salvador, where I live, that project should be written in the cornfields, in the bean fields, in the cabbage fields, where the community lives and works. We need to take the time before we ever sit down and ask for funding from one of the big funders. We need to sit down and live with those communities. And like I said, unfortunately, because we're caught up in the rat race of applying for funding, of staying on top of reports, of monitoring evaluation, many people simply think they don't have we don't have the ability to devote the time to involve the communities. That's an unfortunate reality. So how do we change the timing? The process of listening and participating in the life of the community and facilitating spaces where communities can talk about the realities and engage in authentic problem analysis, that needs to happen before we ever start searching for grants. So instead of applying for grants and then advising the community that, hey, we have a project for gender equality, we have a project for certain types of farming, and that's what generally happens. And again, that goes back to what I was saying here, the pecking order, because what happens oftentimes is that the funding agency at the highest level, at the highest step of the ladder, is the one that imposes. They'll say, right now we have funding for sustainable development goal number 4, quality education. And so the local organization who is applying for the funding has to try and organize their project around that. But a lot of times the communities where this organization is working might not identify education as one of their main needs. It's not the center of their problem analysis, right? So what do we do? That's a reality that's difficult to break, but it's one that we need to recognize that does exist, right? Okay, real quick. So the last part of my talk, and this is, I think, one of the most important aspects, is that we need to understand again that communities have different ideas and suggestions about what it means to live well. Every one of, again, going back to sustainable development goals, every one of those should make sense to a community. Nobody wants poverty, nobody wants sickness, nobody wants gender equality, or gender inequality, sorry. But how communities understand these things is going to be different in different communities. And so there are certain themes in the world of international development that are considered to be universally beneficial: education, health, prosperity. Unfortunately, themes that get a little bit more difficult: industry. These are broad and vague, and they enjoy a certain invulnerability that exempts them from scrutiny. So for example, if you come into a project and you say, we're going to offer scholarships for young people so that they can continue their education, that is almost never criticized. It's never, many people don't even take the time to think about, why that might be good or might be bad, how that might affect the community. The same thing can go for healthcare or poverty alleviation. But I think that every one of the sustainable development goals needs to be criticized in a sense, but not as criticized, but I guess looked at more in depth. Because anytime we unanimously approve, the universal benefits towards development, is that we don't understand the complex and the nuanced realities that define communities that are different from us, communities that are rural, indigenous, Aboriginal, agrarian, non-industrialized communities. They may have different ideas of what it means for education and healthcare and poverty. Those ideas might be very, very different from what we understand in the development world. And so I want to share one of the most exciting development projects that I was involved in was with a university called the Xil University. The Xil people are a Mayan ethnic group that live in the northern part of Guatemala. And there was a French NGO. They had a huge hundreds of thousands of dollars of funding from the European Union, and they were wanting to do something education related. And so the normal ideas, came up. We need to create scholarships so that young people continue their education. There wasn't a university in the biggest town. And so the idea was, maybe let's try and, do something to help young people continue their education. Then they went into the communities in these rural areas and they talked with the mothers, they talked with the elders, they talked with the grandparents, the parents, the farmers. And what they were hearing is that the community said, education is a problem for us, because what happens is that we send our young people to school. And at school, they learn Spanish because the primary language in this community was Ishil, so they still maintain their own language. They learn concepts that are very different to us. The teachers in the school try and teach them that farming, which was the traditional way of life, is backwards, is archaic, is synonymous with poverty. And then what happens is that the young people no longer want to return to our communities because they see it as something that, education helps them escape their lives. And the more that the further the education they have, the more they leave their community. So in this sense, education, what it was doing was depopulating the countryside, depopulating rural areas. It was creating a generational gap between elders and young people. Parents and children could no longer see eye to eye. There was no common ground. A lot of times young people were wanting to leave traditional forms of living well off of the land. And so what this French organization was hearing was that education was a problem. Education in the sense that it was extracting young people from the community, putting it at odds with the community, and essentially, leaving the community without any young people there. And so if education is doing this, what's the benefit? There might be a benefit for the young person. Maybe the young person gets lucky and finds a job in the city or is able to move to the capital. But for the community, education was seen as something extractive, something that was causing problems. So this NGO said, well, what are we going to do? We have this, hundreds of thousands of dollars in grant money to do a project of education. And so they sat down and they said, hey, let's continue to do education, but differently. And so the idea, after several months of talks and debates and things like that, they created what they call the Ishil University. And it was a university, it was an institution of higher learning that focused on teaching young people all of the wealth of knowledge and wisdom of traditional Ishil knowledge and wisdom. And so the idea was that, instead of, having classes in a classroom or, in a university campus, they went into the community and they talked with the midwives. They talked with the traditional healers. They talked with, the farmers, with a lot of the ancestral authorities. This was a community that still had very, very autonomous forms of organization. Obviously, their language, you can see their dress. And they created this whole curriculum where young people could continue their education and learn, but learn in their communities and learn from their community. And it wasn't that they turned their back on Western forms of knowledge. So, for example, when they would learn about all of the wealth of knowledge that traditional healers had. And then what would happen after that class, they would bring in someone that worked at the hospital in the biggest nearest town, and they would compare a lot of the similarities between traditional knowledge and Western knowledge around issues of healthcare, of medicine. And it was a way of teaching young people that there is an enormous amount of knowledge in your communities. That doesn't mean you can't continue your education and learn things from the outside, but it's not about extracting people from the community. It was a way of first helping young people value what existed in their community and then engaging with other forms of knowledge from the outside. And it was a success. It continues there are hundreds of young people that go to this university every year. It's a 2 or 3 year program. And then after that, many young people continue their education at state-sponsored universities throughout Guatemala. But they do that with now an appreciation, and a lot of those young people might go and study law or medicine. But now that they have this appreciation for their own knowledge, for their own communities, a lot of times they come back and complement that traditional forms of knowledge with what they've learned from the outside. So this idea of alternative forms of knowledge, alternative forms of the good life, is something that is very common in post-development thought. I'd like to leave that with you all. There's two Two authors that I would recommend if you all are interested in this. Arturo Escobar is a guy from Colombia. His main book is called Encountering Development. And he believes that development was unavoidably an ideological export and simultaneous act of cultural imperialism. By imposing ideas of what is development onto communities, it was a form of cultural imperialism. Escobar, for him, development was nothing more than the West's convenient discovery of poverty in the third world. And it used it to reassert its moral and cultural superiority in supposedly post-colonial times. Those are harsh words for people who work in the development industry, but I think it's something that's definitely worth thinking about. Another book or another author that just died last year, he was a good friend of ours, Gustavo Esteva. He's an indigenous thinker from Mexico, Central Mexico, from Oaxaca. And he wrote several books. One is called The Future of Development. And one of his unique quotes that I think really gets to the heart of the matter is that he says, for 2/3 of the people on Earth, to think of development, any kind of development, requires first the perception of themselves as underdeveloped in a subordinate position after comparing their own situation with the established standard. And the established standard is wealthy countries from the West, mostly Europe and North America. And so what post-development thinkers are saying, Escobar, Esteva, there's several others, is that the idea of development is actually quite new. There are a lot of people before, if you go back 100 years, there wasn't necessarily this idea that there were certain lifestyles that we needed to attain or that we needed to go towards. That there were some that one type of lifestyle was poverty. There are obviously always issues of misery. There were issues of droughts and famines and things like that. But the idea that every person on Earth had to subscribe to certain standards of living is a relatively new concept, something that kind of came into being in the post-World War II era. And for people to understand development, a lot of times that, for like Esteva is saying here, that starts with saying that, hey, that means that I'm underdeveloped. That means that my own ideas of what it means to live well are wrong or are archaic or are backwards. And I think that is important to understand that different cultures and different peoples may have developed different ways of life that were extremely healthy, that may have been different than ours, but that are definitely worthwhile. And so what does post-development say? It says that, forms of Western colonialism and hegemony have, been manifested, in my part of the world since 1492, which is when Columbus sailed from Europe to here. And in more recent decades, it's been part of an effort to reduce, this violent expansion of colonialism, but still trying to show that every people need to adhere to what we want. Here in Central America, in South America, there's a concept that is growing in popularity. It's called buen vivir. That in Spanish roughly translates to the good life. And it's a concept that has parallels in most indigenous cultures, not just here in the Americas, but throughout the world. And it's the idea that a life and a livelihood where health and wholeness and happiness and fulfillment doesn't necessarily depend on economic growth, consumerism, industrial, technological comforts. What a lot of times, we in the developed world think when we see a problem, we say they need more growth, they need more jobs, they need more, better economy, they need more healthcare. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily always wrong, but the idea of buen vivir is that many place-based communities, especially indigenous communities, have ideas that are different. More money doesn't necessarily mean better life for these communities. And that's something that we need to open our minds to. Indigenous and peasant cultures, they tend to value connection to community, relationship to land, to tradition, to cultural coherency, rootedness to your origins. Those are a lot of times are the main components of a life well lived. And a lot of times, the idea of what it means to live well is going to be very, very dependent on that place. For example, here in Central America, the good life is tied up with, it is essential to corn. Corn is born here. This is where corn is from. The Mayan creation narrative talks about how human beings were made from corn. So corn is the essence of identity. And for people, good life means growing your own corn, growing your own beans, having your own food on hand, and participating in all of the community rituals, all of the community traditions around that, right? So I'm almost done. It's 8:50, or I guess, yeah, 8:50 my time. I wanted to leave a little bit of time if anybody had any questions. But yeah, so real quick, truly participative development should, one, change the time frames of the rat race of the development industry so that we can truly hear and learn from those communities. Number two, be open to negotiating projects based on what is found, you know, and that might mean challenging those hierarchical ladders along the development industry. And most importantly, number three, be willing to challenge our own preconditioned ideas regarding what development is, what poverty is, what the good life entails, and learn from communities and development projects in participation with them. So that's what I would like to say today. I appreciate the opportunity. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I would love to hear.
That was really quite awesome, Tobias Roberts. We never missed the point at Atlantic International University. All the live class sessions we've had recently have proved to be really exactly what our family at Atlantic International University needs. You've done a superb job, Roberts. All the concepts expected in such a presentation were there. The clarity, the precision, the hands-on with all the examples that you have provided, the adequacy, because we got it all. Let me remind our students that Tobias Roberts has extensive experience living in El Salvador about community development, participatory development. And with the clear examples that he has offered with this presentation, we really got everything we could need when he exemplified how people can pull together to pitch in whatever a community is doing to make life good or better for everybody. In his last example, he explained very clearly that good life does not depend very specifically on what this community, this country, this region understands about that concept. It is all relative because it all contingent upon your own view, your own understanding, your own expectations, your own goals. But I was not the presenter. Tobias Roberts was. I really commend you very highly, Roberts, for this presentation. But pretty much like you just said, let's now open the floor to our participants so that they can raise issues or questions about your presentation. Alois, you are the first one, so go ahead. Ask your question, please.
Okay, thank you so much for giving me the floor. I'm from GRC. I'm living in Lubumbashi. Yeah, but over time, I went in South Africa for 1 year, and then I came back. What I'm seeing in my place here is every year we've got many young people who went to school and got a diploma or whatever, but we don't have job, and we do have many spaces and a lot of natural resources, but we don't have even a capital in order to start or doing something like to involve our community in green economics. So I'm asking you right now my question, how do you think, what can we do in order to involve our community because our government is not involving in changing our community, our mindset. We've got some place where people that don't even know what is a bank account, imagine. So what can we do in order to change our community in that way? Because we've got many people who went to school, doesn't have a job, they are up and down looking for where if they can find a job. And we do have a lot of spaces, natural resources, but how can we involve those young people?
All right, thank you very much for your question, Alois and Roberts. What is your stand on that?
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess I would start by saying I know nothing about Africa. I've never been there, and it would, I think it would be incorrect for me to say this is what you need, because that's what I was saying is I think it's the opposite. But no, like you said, every community has resources. You mentioned you have resources, green things, and I would say, yeah, it starts there. You know, help the community understand what are some of the strengths, what are some of the opportunities, and then yeah, look at what has worked in the past. I think that this idea of sustainability isn't just projects. People always look to create sustainable lives. Like we want to live well. So I think it starts by looking at, you know, what has worked historically for your community. You know, how have people lived well over time, and then yeah, what can be improved. It's not to say that everything that comes from the outside is wrong or is going to be harmful, but it starts, I think it always starts about what has worked historically for your people, and how outside ideas can be used to augment, you know, those sustainable life ways. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Roberts. And like you just pointed it out, there is an issue, you know, when you have to get outside donors involved. This is a problem. This is the point that Ashabrik Nantage is trying to make on the chat line. So I'm going to ask you to try to make a comment or respond. What that participant is saying is, I certainly don't think this community participation is about to happen under the current circumstances, where by everything we do, we are influenced by the Western world, because they are the donors. Now we're talking about money. Everything we want to do, we've got to have the money. We don't have the money, then we've got to follow what the Western world is saying. What is your stand on that, Roberts?
No, I agree. And like I said, it's a hierarchical model. That's personally, that's why you know, I made the decision to leave the world of development, because it is frustrating. It is frustrating when people impose ideas, you know, from the top to the bottom. What I would say is that, you know, I've seen some great examples of communities where the development game in financing and funding is kind of like a dance, right? You know, when you're applying for funding for a project, you have to say the right things because they have the money. But once you won that project, you know, there's very few instances where, you know, that the donor agency is going to come and cancel that project. Maybe that sounds like a little bit of like a guerrilla warfare tactic, but for example, I know lots of examples where, you know, communities you know, hired people who know the language, you know, that write what the donor wants to hear in all of their projects. But then with the money, you know, once that was in hand, there's not most of the times, you know, big donor agencies aren't going to have this hands-on approach to you know, really trying to micromanage how those funds are. A lot of times they might send one or two people once a year or once during the project cycle to see what's happening. But in general, when that money is in your hands, you can, you know, as a local organization, you know, a lot of times you can choose how that's spent. And I'm not saying that maybe that seems like a little dishonest, but I think that that's generally what happens, you know, with money, was as it gets funneled down, once it's in your hands in the community, that's where, you know, true decision is you know takes place. And so, yeah, being willing to change certain ideas about what a project and have that project respond to what you hear from the communities you're working with. I think that that might be a good strategy to do.
All right. Let's go to a question now with Gibson Salim. Are we ready for you, Gibson? Gibson, I just turned your microphone on. I hope it is connected.
Yes, and
right.
yes, my question is just direct that first is to thank the presenter for the wonderful information and research he has done, and the different people and the lives that he has touched. Now that we have a challenge in Africa continent, can we still be form the part of the ambassadors of the change to the community involvement from the support that he has done already?
Yeah, what is the question then, Gibson?
If we in Africa, now that he has not been in a position to visit, that we welcome him to be part of us, to support us in making the change.
Okay.
That's an invitation, Roberts. You are invited to go to Africa and get involved in what they're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Gibson. I always appreciate those invitations, so thank you.
All right. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, we are listening to Tobias Roberts, who has truly extensive experience. And we can see that from both a practical and a theoretical standpoint. He has university degrees in the field, and he's been in El Salvador, like he said, for the last 20 years, very, very closely involved in what the communities they are trying to do. So if you have an issue, if you have a point of view, whatever it is that you would like Roberts to clarify for you, go ahead and do so at this time. If you are new and are not very familiar with how to proceed, you can just go to the bottom of your screen, assuming that you are using a computer, and that horizontal menu has one of the options now, which is reactions. When you hover your mouse on the reactions icons, you're gonna see a hand, a little hand icon, yellow, which you click on, and this will tell us and tell Roberts that you want to make a comment or ask a question. And we are ready for your question. Dr. Eamon, go ahead.
Okay, I would like to thank you for this excellent lecture about the success of any project for the benefit of community. I agree that the involvement is a main factor in the success of any project, but I would like to add also 2 points: readiness and also knowing the importance. So if the people who is involved in this project, already in the lecture, it was elaborated nicely how the involvement is going to contribute in the success of any project in the world. However, knowing the importance in the community itself, when the people, like the example of the women and washing the clothes, if they were been aware, and some programs and education was strongly fostered to make them aware of the importance and the benefit of using the water in their houses, then it will be different. Maybe it will take times for the awareness programs. However, it is one factor of the success of any project. The other thing is the readiness. So readiness, any project should not be started before the readiness of the people involved. So otherwise, it will contribute either in the delay of the success or not be successful. That's it. I just want to add these 2 points. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to listen to this lecture.
That is awesome, Dr. Eman.
Thank you.
People have to be ready, whatever they want to do. If they want to get the members of the community to be involved in their projects, readiness is a key ally, a key concept, because if people don't have the tools, the necessary tools, the experts, whatever is needed to make sure that the project be successful, then it's just gonna be, they're not gonna go anywhere. They have to be ready. Thank you very much for that comment, Dr. Eman. We are turning now to Al-Zira, Dos Race. We are ready for you at this time, Al-Zira.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm Alzira from East Timor. Thank you for the presentation. It was really good presentation. But my question is, we are using the participatory analysis to ensure the community participation in project implementation, project design, and then implementation, and the monitoring and evaluation itself. But I want to ask, my question is how we can ensure the sustainability of the community development program itself, because my experience, because my background, I have been working with NGO, non-government organization for 18 years. Then there is some community organization that with the participatory analysis and then involvement of the community, but sustainability is the challenge in here in my country. So I want to get some idea how we can ensure the sustainability of the program within the community. Thank you.
Roberts?
Yeah, sustainability of projects and community development programs are an issue. And a lot of times, because I guess in the worst case scenario, I think one of the problems is that whenever funding runs out, that's when the project ends. That's generally a lot of times what happens, is that the project goes well and is working supposedly on paper, but as soon as the funding stops, the project stops. And I'd like to refer to something that Abdul Rahman Kamara said up here. He says in the chat, it said community development is localized, I believe. In that regard, we must pull local resources together, including human, to develop our communities and depend less on donors. For me, that's the essence of sustainability. When a community says that we don't need donors, a lot of times, one of the maxims or the sayings in community development is that development workers, especially those that come from the outside, say that we are trying to work ourselves out of a job. And the idea is that, the community takes over ownership of the project and that the community development organization is no longer needed. I think if we're going to be honest with ourselves, the people who work in community development don't want to be left out of a job. It's a pathway, it's a source of income for them. But no, I think from the community level, the idea is that that the community can engage in their own development processes without focusing on donors. So whether that just means pulling together human labor, whether that means putting together your physical labor for a project, creating forms of organization that don't depend on any sort of money, outside money, that's when things usually generally stick. So one real quick example here, we have a community ecotourism project here in the community where we live. And it's something that was pulled together and created without any source of external funding. We're a group of 10 families that have different ecotourism. We live in the mountains and people come up here and visit the mountains. And it's something that came together because people wanted an extra source of income, and it wasn't hard. And I think that, in essence, had there been external money involved, and had there been grants and saying, here, we can give you this money to build something, it may have been more difficult. There may have been more problems in the community. A lot of times funding, external sources of funding can create friction and conflict in the community. But yeah, so how do you create, how do you create a project? You create sustainability within a program. I think one is encourage people to put in their own time and effort. The other thing I would say is that focus on forms of organization that already exist. If we go back to that example I talked about, women's councils versus a softball team. In every community, there's going to be some sort of organization. So instead of trying to create that organization, work with what already exists, because with what already exists is already sustainable, because it has been there before the community, before the project started. And so, yeah, engage with what already exists, encourage more participation, of course. But yeah, find what's working for the community and develop a project around that. And I think that can definitely help create more long-term sustainability with any project or with any program.
All right. Israel, enjoy them. We are turning the floor now to Israel. Go ahead, Israel. There seems to be a problem, an issue with your microphone, Israel. Maybe we might have to grant the opportunity to somebody else, another attendee. Let me also remind you, ladies and gentlemen, as we have already run out of time, so we have room for just one or two more questions. As I'm waiting for hands to be raised, let me remind you there are two books that Tobias Roberts recommended during his presentation on this topic of participatory development. The Future of Development by Gustavo Estera, and there is also Encountering Development, written by Arturo Escobar. So two very important books. We're not going to be talking about them now, but again, they are wonderful recommendations by the presenter. Denise Bentek, that may be the last question for now. We are ready for you, Denise.
Sorry. Yes. Good morning.
Morning.
Yes, I am Denise Bentic from Guyana in South America. Now, I had the pleasure, it's not a question, but I had an opinion. I had the pleasure of working with the African Development Foundation in Botswana for 8 years. And we started out as a country office, but then there was some strategic thinking, and then they signed contracts with a local partner. So the staff created an organization and was contracted as a local partner organization. And that proved beneficial because we were on the ground. So we continued to work, or we worked with various types of community organization and prepared them to apply for grants. And so they knew in advance what were the objectives and what they needed to be accountable for. So there was no issue in terms of projects not fitting in with what the community needs. And that option was very, very successful. And I know they had those in Botswana, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Namibia, Cape Verde, in not South Africa, in Ghana, you know, many of the, about 14 African countries, Kenya and so on, and it was very successful. And then I had another opportunity to work with the Canadian Hunger Foundation, and that was back home in my country. And community participation and involvement was very successful, except in one area. And even though the group was located in a area which we would say on the coastal area, the accessibility involved going by road and by boat. So you could not go there every day. You could not go there every day. And they did not have any community structures. The project which we implemented with that community, they were agriculture-based community. And the project which we implemented was one where we provided the implements. They needed a lot of implements, you know, various type of implements to do the agriculture. But those implements, when bought, had to be stored by one or two of the members. And this is why I had that comment about those who are assertive tend to take over. You know, you leave it to the community and the assertive ones tend to take over and they make the donor an issue because they don't want to be accountable. So that local, a few of the local members held on to the equipment and the broader membership was not benefiting. And as such, the project failed because they couldn't get the implements to use, and you know, a few members held on to them as if it was their own. And eventually you had to retrieve those things. And of course the project failed in the area because you didn't know who else. The alternative would have been to ensure that there is some structure where it could have been stored independent of persons' homes, because you can't walk into people's homes and take those implements, you know, to use. That's their private space. So that was an instance when it did not work because we did not think through, well, where would the implements be stored so that everyone could have access when they needed it, and not store those implements at someone's home and then they had control and you know, and you were their women fancy. So that's my contribution. It could work, but you have to really do your analysis. When you're doing your needs assessment and so on, you also have to look at what infrastructure is on the ground to support the successful implementation of that project or program.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much.
Thank you very much again, Denise. And this was the last comment or question about this presentation of Tobias Roberts. Let me remind every attendee, the entire session's been recorded and will be made available within your student portal. Also, by the way, I don't know if you have noticed that Roberts was nice enough to have sent a copy of that presentation to the chat line. So before we close up, you have the opportunity to click on that link and download the entire set of slides, PowerPoint slides, consisting of the beautiful points of view examples and other components of that awesome presentation by Tobias Roberts. I want to thank everybody. I want to have a special expression of gratitude to our presenter. And I will turn the floor again to you, Roberts, for the conclusion remarks, if you want.
Thank you all for inviting me and for your participation, for your comments, for your questions. The development industry is full of opportunities to do wonderful things, and it's also plagued by, I think, a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of problems. So I think whoever works in that, you know, that's the dichotomy we work with, and I hope that, yeah, that, you know, in whatever work we do, the more that you involve local communities in every decision-making process, you know, the better results for everyone. So thank you all again, and I hope you all have a great day.